Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're just going to give it one more minute, let everybody join our meeting here, and we'll get started shortly. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and welcome to tonight's program with our author, Professor David Gibson. He is here to discuss his new book, Planting Clues: How Plants Solve Crimes. Planting Clues details the important evidence that can be gathered from plants, algae, and fungi at a crime scene, and exposes the role this evidence has played in high-profile criminal trials. Copies of the book are available for purchase at Hudson's Independent Bookstore, The Learned Owl, and we will be putting a link in the chat to purchase the book if you're interested. Additionally, there will be time tonight for a Q&A with David, so please feel free to submit your questions throughout the duration of the program using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And now to introduce our author tonight, David Gibson is a professor of plant biology and university distinguished scholar at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. He is the senior editor of the Journal of Ecology and is the author of several books, including Grasslands and Climate Change, Methods in Comparative Plant Population Ecology, and Grasses and Grassland Ecology. And with that, I will pass things over to him to get started this evening.
Thanks, Alexis. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to participate in your book program. This is really exciting for me. I'm calling this the first step on my book tour, although I haven't left home. But anyway, it's a great opportunity for me to talk about this subject, which is so interesting to me. And as Alexis said, this is sort of a different topic to the other books I've done in the past, and I'll explain why as we go through. So this slide shows us a scene from CSI Cyber, TV crime scene. And I saw this, and we can see Ted Danson is one of the principal actors in this series. And he's looking, I suppose he's in his lab or his office or somewhere, but he's got a book in front of him, just about to see it, called Forensic Botany. And when I saw that, I thought, well, this is an interesting topic, because I'm a botanist, and that's what I teach most of the time. But, I like watching crime shows and things like that, like many of us do. And I saw that, I thought, this is really, really cool. And so it's a real book. It's not just a stage prop. Here is my copy of that very same book. So there's a lot of reality in some of these fictional series and books and so forth. And we'll talk a bit about that as we go on. But what I want to talk about today specifically, before we get onto the kind of fictional stuff, is why I wrote the book in the first place. And then the main sort of topics that I'll cover, first of all, we'll talk about something called Lockharts exchange principle. This is common for all forensic work. And then I'll talk about some applications of forensic botany, some of the main areas that it's used for. I'll talk a bit about expert witnesses, which is what happens if you look at this sort of evidence and you're not in law enforcement, you get brought in to go into court to present evidence. And I'll go through a number of the famous cases, high-profile cases where this evidence has been used. And we'll talk a bit about fiction at the end. So why did I write this book? In part because a number of years ago, I was given the sort of opportunity, in quotes, by my department chair to teach a new course. He said, you've got to teach some more, come up with a course. And I was just thinking about what I could do that would be interesting for me and would be a botany course. And so I came up with this course that I teach called Forensic Botany. It's for senior level students. And we have the textbook you see on the right called Forensic Botany. It's not the one that Danson was looking at. It's another one by Hall and Bird. And we use that, but that's very cut and dried. It's a textbook. And having written a few textbooks, I realized they're difficult for people to read. And when I showed them to my family, and they yawn and say, oh, another textbook, I thought, well, maybe I could write a book this time that is more accessible to the public and the interesting reader. And so that's what this book is. It's what they call a trade book. It's not supposed to be a textbook. And that was quite a challenge for me to write in this sort of genre, in this sort of way, to engage the reader and take the reader through the course of the material, rather than a textbook where you might dip in from particular things. So anyway, I teach this course, Forensic Botany. But to get into the meat of materials, so Lockharts exchange principle, really important. This underlies all forensic work, not just forensic botany. And this comes from a French man called Edmond Lockhart. And back in the 1930s, he set up the first police laboratory, forensic laboratory in Lyon in France, actually set up in 1910. He's really the founder of forensic science. And so he did a lot of different forensic things, blood, spatter, and fingerprints, and all the usual sort of things. But he also recognized that when a perpetrator visits a crime scene, or makes a crime scene, they're liable to leave with materials on their clothes, on their fingers, on their shoes, and so forth, of material that's at the crime scene. So I got a couple of quotes up here from his writings. He was also a prolific writer. It's all in French, though. But part of what he said is, the truth is that none can act with the intensity induced by criminal activities without leaving multiple traces of his path. And he also said later, sometimes the perpetrator leaves traces at a scene by their actions. Sometimes, alternatively, he or she picked up on their clothes or on their body traces of their location or presence. And again, this is just all sorts of materials. And he referred to the small stuff as there's poisson organic dust. And he talks in his work not only about some more conventional small pieces of things, but also about plant fragments, pollen, seed, plant leaves, and so forth. So really, he's suggesting that if you got a victim and a crime scene at the bottom here, and a suspect, they'll link to each other. This is this idea of exchange. The physical evidence is exchange between the crime scene, victim, and the suspect. And what the investigators need to do is find out what that evidence is and see if it links between the crime scene, the victim, and the suspect. And in many cases, botanical materials can be used for exactly this purpose. So in legal investigations, both crimes against people, but also other ways, plant materials can be really important. And I've just got a list of some of these here, starting with crimes against persons, which is what I'm going to focus on today. But there's also a lot of other reasons why botanists need to get involved in legal cases. Tracing or the tracking of illegal drugs. You've got to figure out what the drug is. If it's a plant drug, cocaine or something like that. Agricultural weeds may need to be identified. Exotic plants that are invading we don't want, we're going to be able to figure out what those are. And noxious weeds, these are plants that are not wanted in agricultural settings. Rare plants, which are poached out of rainforests and places like that, like orchids and trees used for furniture, have to be identified. It's supposed to be stopped at borders and so forth. Biofuel escapes, things get in the wrong place, planting prohibited GM crops. They need to figure out if someone has used some seed from a seed company they're not supposed to use. And as I mentioned before, plant poaching. All of these can involve the need to identify a whole plant, a fragment of a plant, some seeds, some pollen, some spores, and sometimes DNA. On the right here, we see ginseng. It's a medicinal herb. It's the rhizome at the bottom that we can see. That's what is used. But of course, if you can, someone is poaching this out of a forest, then someone needs to work out what they've got. And if they've got leaves and the fruit, that might be fairly easy. But if they've just got the rhizome at the bottom, that can get really hard to identify that. That's where you need to have a botanist. So That's general botanical stuff, why it's important. Some types of cases where botanical information can be used. Busting alibis. That's the idea that a suspect says, I wasn't there. Nothing to do with me. I was at home at the time, or I was with my mates in the bar having a drink. The claim or piece of evidence that one was elsewhere when an act was being taken place. And botanical evidence can come into play here. And there's some high-profile cases where this has happened. So Ted Bundy, the serial killer, and Jamie Saffron, another serial killer, both got tripped up by plant material. In Bundy's case, the vehicle that he used in one of his crimes had plant fragments caught up in the undercarriage of his vehicle. And they could identify those fragments and go back to the crime scene and find the same species of plants. Jamie Saffron's case, particularly nasty person he was, he dismembered his victims and he took them away and dumped them out in the forest and the woods and so forth. He didn't know when he did that parts of plants that were growing in his own yard, his own house, were caught up on those victims. And when they got those severed body parts, they found plant fragments on them and they identified them and said, these grow in your house. That places the victim back at the crime scene where they were murdered. So two really high-profile cases where botanical evidence was part of the evidence put forward to help convict these people. Timing of events. Plants can be really important with timing because plants grow through the year. Annual plants have a distinct growing season. So if you find an annual plant as trace evidence and it's in flower, then that can give you a timing of when that material was associated with that crime scene or with that body part or whatever. Plants that are buried or disturbed or wilt, if leaves or branches are broken, sometimes sap will come out. If they're buried, the chlorophyll on the green materials in the leaves will degrade. And knowing the timing of those events can be very important. Having plants at a particular growth stage can be relevant too. And all of this enables investigators to sometimes work out or help them work out what's called the post-mortem interval, PMI. How long has a body been at a place? It's post-mortem interval. These figures here show a couple of examples of this. That skull has got a tree growing through it. I hope you can see am I mousing this correctly? You can see the mouse? Yeah, okay, good. I was mousing the wrong screen a second ago. But this skull has got a tree growing through it. So all you got to do is chop it and count the growth rings, and you know that that tree was growing through that skull for that many years. Now, the skull may have been there longer than that, but it gives you an indication of the timing. This bottom skull here, this is from a real case where mosses were found growing over part of the skull, you can see here. And in that particular case, they know how fast the moss grows and how often it branches. Because you see, these aren't single threads, but it's branching. And knowing that, you can estimate how long that moss must have been growing on that skull. Again, evidence towards the PMI. Excuse me. I'm giving you kind of the unusual examples here. Gastric contents. When we eat food, it stays in our stomach for about 2 to 6 hours, and then it empties down into the small intestine. So what they can do is to look at the stomach contents, and figure out what the plant parts are, and that will give you an indication of the last meal of a victim. That can be really important. In one case, they identified the stomach contents, and it didn't correspond to what they knew was they thought was the last meal at lunchtime, but for a later meal, that helped tie a victim to a crime scene and to a person that ate with them. So this is pretty gruesome stuff, but it allows, again, the post-mortem interval and locations of last meals to be identified. It's also important in kind of more routine things like ingestion of toxic plants and drug abuse, where it might need to do some chemical analysis to find out what someone has unfortunately eaten or ingested. So here's an example of plant fragments. And this is what was conducted by a University of Colorado professor called Jane Bock, who was an ecologist and a botanist. And she was invited to look at stomach contents of a raped and murdered young woman, and also to look at fecal stains that were on the suspect's clothing. So they had a suspect and they wanted to tie the suspect to the victim in some manner. So they looked at her fecal samples from the victim. They looked at samples collected on the victim's clothing, and they looked at samples collected on the suspect itself. And they found they had the same plant materials. This is one of them, pepper seed. And these are kind of fuzzy because you're dealing with fragments that have been in someone's body that people have been eating. But when this young lady was murdered, as is common, unfortunately, victims will soil themselves. And in this case, with rape going on, some of her feces got onto her clothing and some got onto the suspect's clothing. But the same plants, and this is just one of the species, matched between them all. So this places the suspect, or at least his clothing, to the victim and her clothing. And in this case, a guilty conviction was attained. Now, I mentioned that people involved in botanical forensics often have to go to court. As far as I know, police forensic laboratories don't employ actual botanists, so they outsource this sort of work. And one example was a colleague of mine called Dr. Barbara Crandall-Stotler from my university. A long time ago, back in 1991, she was invited to be an expert witness in a murder case. In this particular case, defendant Charles Ashley was accused of multiple counts of murder and arson for an event that took place down here in southern Illinois. There were two victims. Well, there was a main victim, a mother, Lindbergh Buchanan, and her two daughters. And the bodies were discovered in a house that had been deliberately set fire. The mother had died of strangulation. The children had died of smoke inhalation. So they were able to get a suspect, and they wanted to tie the suspect to this crime. And the chief police investigator noticed there were some plant fragments on clothing of the suspect, under the fingernails of the victim, and on some clothing that was found at the crime scene. So they gathered these plant fragment materials up and took them to Dr. Crandall-Stotler and said, what is this? Are these all the same? Or are they different? Can they help us tie the suspect to the crime scene? So here is some of this evidence. She actually shared with me some of the original slides that she had. So here are plant fragments off the victim's clothing, Exhibit 10, another item from another part of her clothing, and Exhibit 11 from the defendant's coat that was found on the bedroom floor. These all look pretty much the same, don't they? And if you're a botanist, you'll realize that these are all leaves of sphagnum, peat moss. And it's quite an easy plant to identify because they've got these long cells here. So I'm masked the wrong screen. These long cells here with smaller cells around them. That's very characteristic of peat moss leaves. And then this border is kind of thickened. You can see that, pretty characteristic as well. But all of these exhibits are the same peat moss. So this is tying the victim's clothing to defendant's clothing. Then they looked at scrapings under the victim's fingernails, same plant, same peat moss. Number 26 is from a torn T-shirt that was found in the defendant's car. And number 28 is from a bandana of the suspect that was found in the suspect's car. So we got the same plant under the fingernails of the victim, on the victim's clothing, on suspect's clothing, and on clothing that he had left at the crime scene, and clothing that he had taken back with him and left in his car. It's the same plants. It ties everybody, everything together. So the conclusion that Dr. Crandall-Stotler made was that this botanical material from the same source. It's from horticultural peat. That's the stuff you buy in big plastic bags and you put it on your bedding plants and so forth. There's some soil and vermiculite mixed in with it as well that suggests it's part of a potting mixture. So she looked at all this material under microscopes in her lab, and then went into court and testified. And in the court, she was questioned, first of all, about her credentials. Does she have the qualifications to be identifying these plant materials? The methods she used, did she use appropriate scientific methods to identify these plant materials? And her conclusion. So the first part of being an expert witness after you've done the work is to satisfy the court that you have the qualifications to be making this determination. And she did, because she is a world expert on mosses. So as I said, she showed the similarity between the botanical fragments on the victim's clothing, on the t-shirt and the bandana, and on the victim himself. All this, along with other evidence, allowed the police to convict the suspect and found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Just so, sorry about that. Just so you can see, this picture here shows us different species of sphagnum. So there are different species of sphagnum, and in this case, they were all the same species of sphagnum, of peat moss. So it wasn't just a question of saying, this is peat moss, it's which particular peat moss that she had to use her expertise to identify. All right, so more about some famous cases that you may know something about already. I already mentioned Ted Bundy, and I mentioned Jamie Saffron. Another recent high-profile case was that of Casey and Kaylee Anthony. You may recall in this case, the young girl, Kaylee, was abducted from the house, and all the suspicion fell upon the mother, who for various reasons gave all sorts of conflicting accounts of what was going on. She blamed herself. She didn't blame herself. She blamed the housekeeper. She blamed her father and all sorts of things. So there was a need to get to the bottom of all this. Eventually, they unfortunately found the body of the young girl out in the woods. And this is where the botany comes into play. They needed to know at this point how long the body had been lying on the ground in the woods. So both the prosecution and the defense team brought in their own expert witness botanist. And they both gave different accounts of how long they thought the body had been in the woods. And Dr. Jane Bock, who did the gastric contents work that I just talked about, was a witness for the defense. And she stated that the remains had been in the area for only about 2 months. And they said, well, how do you know that? And she said, because I can look at the leaves underneath the body, and the extent to which those leaves are decomposed and being flattened tells me it's been 2 weeks. Now, the prosecution witness, whose name is Dr. Hall, he said, no, it's been longer than that. It's been 6 months. So here's a case, we've got two dueling botanists, if you like, given different sorts of evidence or interpreting the evidence in a different way in the same courtroom. At the end of the day, the mother was found innocent, and they never did convict anyone of this crime. The botanical evidence was really interesting. It's a small part of a much bigger case, but really interesting to look at this case, the timing of events. Two other high-profile cases, the Baby Lindbergh case and the Maricopa case. Let me go through those. So the Lindbergh case, this is back in the 1930s, and this is one of the very first cases where botanical evidence was brought into court. So you may recall that, or know of Charles Lindbergh, who flew the Spirit of St. Louis across the Atlantic, the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic in 1927. You see a picture of him up in the top corner. For this and other reasons, he was a celebrity at the time. Unfortunately, one evening, on March the 1st, 1932, his young son, Charles, also called Charles, was kidnapped from the upper floor bedroom in the house. The parents, Charles and his wife, were downstairs eating, and then the nurse, the childminder, came running down. The child's gone, kidnapped. So as a high-profile case, it creates an awful lot of fuss and everything. There's tons of journalists and all this sort of thing going on. The key part of evidence they found in this case was a ladder, and you can see that ladder against the wall here. This is a homemade ladder, and this was made by the kidnapper. And put up against the wall, and the kidnapper climbed up the ladder and climbed in the window and kidnapped the baby. So they needed to find out who made this ladder and where it came from to tie a suspect to the crime scene. So they brought in a forester, an expert on wood anatomy, and he took apart the ladder. He did microscopic work to look at the different sorts of wood in the railings and the rungs, and he found out what they were. He looked at the saw cuts and the planing of pieces of the ladder and was able to work out which sawmill had cut these pieces of lumber. And that sawmill was a place where the prime suspect they had was working. He also found that some of the rungs had been cut out of the suspect's attic in his own home. So here we see a picture here showing part of the attic and the wood in the attic. And here's a rung off that ladder that he cut out. So apparently what happened was that the suspect had stolen some wood from the wood mill where he was working, but didn't have quite enough to make his ladder. And so cut some wood out of his house to finish up the ladder. So this really tied the suspect to the crime scene. Wood from his own home on the ladder and wood from the place he worked. This evidence was brought into court and the man was found guilty. This case is the last case of the first real case of bringing botanical evidence into court. This is the first case where DNA evidence had been brought in, back in 1992. And at this time, DNA evidence had been brought into cases based upon human remains or human DNA. So that was already in the courts, but it hadn't been brought in for plants until this point. And this is a case where in Maricopa County in Arizona, which is where Phoenix is, a woman's body was found in the brush at an abandoned factory. They had a suspect because they found a pager on the ground. You remember pagers from years ago? Maybe not. Some of you might remember pagers before we had cell phones. But anyway, that identified the suspect, someone called Mark Balkan. So they had a suspect. They need to tie the suspect to the crime scene. In the back of his pickup truck, they found seed pods of a Palo Verde tree. This is a very common tree around there. If you can just about see in that picture there, that's what they look like. And they're all over in Arizona. But they did some DNA analysis that matched those seed pods to a tree right next to where the body was found. Not just any Palo Verde tree, but the very same tree. So it wasn't a question of what sort of tree is it, but is it the tree? And it was. And this led to a murder conviction, and it established the admissibility of plant DNA evidence in the courts. Since then, it's been used, I won't say routinely, but it's accepted. It's an accepted technique, just like human DNA. And so this leads to use of DNA fingerprinting, which gives you the exact tree. In this case, DNA barcoding, which can be used to identify unknown species. And now they're developing what's called eDNA, which is environmental DNA, which is where they can extract DNA from water samples or from air samples and work out what sort of species are found there. eDNA work is what they're doing when they sample sewer samples for COVID. They've taken the DNA and they know it's COVID, so then the COVID is still out in that area where the water sample is taken. COVID's not a plant, of course, but just thought I'd mention that. All right, so to finish up, forensic botany in fiction. So I mentioned that I kind of came to this topic from being a botanist and also from being interested in the crime genre and reading Agatha Christie books and so forth and watching CSI and NCIS and so forth. And it's really interesting to read in this genre because to look at the evidence from my perspective, to kind of think about how are they doing this? Are they doing this right? The older work, Agatha Christie work, is mostly about poisons, identifying the poison or showing that the poison was in the hands of the suspect and so forth. And in fact, Agatha Christie, who herself was a trained chemist, apothecary's assistant, knew all about poisons, and she used loads of them in her books. And so there's actually a book called A is for Arsenic, The Poisons of Agatha Christie. It's fascinating. It goes through all the poisons she uses in all the cases. But there's a lot of other poisons and botanical evidence in other fiction as well. Shakespeare. Agatha Christie, I mentioned Sherlock Holmes, and then some more modern novels by the Peggy Lee Garden mysteries, the Claire Sharp's investigations, the Cadfael Chronicles, and on TV we see CSI, NCIS, and on crime shows where occasionally they have some botanical evidence. It's really interesting to me when I see that. So that actually brings me to my 8th chapter in my book. I'll talk about my book in a second, but actually it's a 7-chapter book. There are actually 8 chapters, one that didn't make it in the book because the publisher said it didn't fit. I think it was, it could have been. Anyway, this is a chapter that is not in the book, but it's available for free download to kind of complete the book if you're interested, or read it first if you like. So it's Forensic Botany and Fiction, and the title of it is Juice of Cursed Hebanon. And you'll have to read it to figure out what that title means. But I'll say it's something to do with Shakespeare. So I talk about fiction in that it's a short book that you can download for nothing, or you can pay 99 cents on Amazon to get it on your Kindle. But the book itself, the reason why you invite me to talk tonight, is organized in these 7 chapters listed here. And just to give you an idea what the chapters are really about, the first chapter is about the Lindbergh case that I mentioned earlier on. Second chapter is about Lockhart and expert witnesses. Then I talk specifically about plant fragments, pollen and spores, DNA, and then in detail about poisons and drugs and poaching. So that's kind of the flow of the book and the different chapters. So with that, I'm very grateful and thankful that you gave me the chance to talk about my book and talk about a subject that I'm very interested in this evening. And if you want to get in touch with me later on, you can. I've got my email there, my Twitter account there. And I think at this point, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much for that, David. That was great. We do have a couple questions coming in. One person was interested to know how insects on plants are used when determining the timing of a crime.
Insects?
Mm-hmm.
Well, insects can be used for the timing because insects will colonize ground or a body, and insects go through different life history stages. So if you see maggots, or if you see flies, or if you see pupae, and you know how long it takes them to develop to those stages, that can give you an indication of how long that body has been decomposing. Mm-hmm. And same with fungi that might grow on a body. You get some idea of how long it takes. And I gave the example of the moss growing on a scalp. How long does it take to grow? If you know these timings, then that gives you an idea. You can work backwards. If there are maggots there, say, well, maggots don't appear for 30 days, so it's got to be 30 days old, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Someone else is wondering, how could the timelines of how long the Anthony baby was in the woods be so far apart between the two botanists? And what made the prosecution's witness believe that the child was in the woods for 6 months?
Well, I don't know if they actually believed it was 6 months. I think it's more a case for these two botanists that the evidence kind of conflicted each other. So they may have actually said, well, we can't tell either way. But this was a case where it was really difficult because just seeing the compressed leaves and the degradation of the leaves and the decomposition, in this case, this is where the two experts used their expert knowledge to come up with an estimate. In other cases, actual experiments are done. So for example, Jane Bock gave the 2-week estimate, had another case where a body was found in a ditch and there were some decayed sunflowers on top of the body. So to work that out, she actually collected sunflowers from the field next to where the body was found and picked these fresh sunflowers and took them back to her lab and literally watched them decompose to reach the same stage of decomposition that was on top of the body. I don't know, it was 10 days or so. So that then, she said, okay, if I found them at this stage of decomposition, by doing an experiment that suggests that they were at this state, they've been on the body for this amount of time. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Someone was curious about forensic botany and fiction and was wondering, is the fiction really that far away from the truth?
Yes and no. Sometimes in fiction, they make up plants to suit themselves, plants that don't exist. Shakespeare did this. In the modern TV shows, mostly what they show is possible, but not in the time frame that they give. So, and a lot of the cases, they don't separate the roles properly. So they have the famous detective go out to the crime scene, find something, bring it back, give it to his lab tech. 10 seconds later, they've done a DNA test, I've identified it, and go, oh yeah, of course. So it's all really too fast is mostly what thing is. And they're using techniques that just take a lot longer in reality than it really take.
Going back to DNA barcoding, someone was curious to know, how is specific plant DNA used in identifying some of those kind of specifics about the location or, timing, things like that?
Yeah. So with the DNA, what you're trying to do is to work out what the plant is, the identity of the plant. It's not so much a timing event, but if you know what the identity is. So DNA barcoding means you extract the DNA from the fragments or the pollen or whatever, and then you match it up against DNA databases to figure out what species it is. For the fingerprinting, you have to match it up against known specimens, like in the case I mentioned, where they matched the Palo Verde, the seed pods, up to the actual Palo Verde tree next to the body. And that's a kind of a more detailed DNA sort of work. So it's not so much a timing thing, it's IDing.
In regards to pollen, someone was wondering, how long does pollen remain viable?
Well, it may not remain viable for that long because it's a single cell, but the pollen grain will remain intact for thousands of years. Pollen grains are covered with what's called an exeme, which is a kind of a waxy covering, and that is completely resistant to almost everything. And so pollen accumulates all over the place. And although the pollen grain may be dead, the pollen grain is still there. In fact, one of the ways to extract pollen from sediments and other things is to put them in hydrofluoric acid, which dissolves glass and dissolves everything away, and all you're left is the pollen grains. And different pollen grains are diagnostic of different species.
Someone else was curious to know, are there a lot of other college courses for people who are interested in forensic botany as a career, and is there an internship required for studying this field?
I wish there were. I don't know of other college courses. I think that Hall, that wrote one of the textbooks I mentioned, he offers some workshops you can pay to go to for 3 or 4 days. As far as I know, are the forensics courses that are scattered around. Different universities and so forth will have forensics minors. They'll offer a course, and they may spend a day or two on plants. But I actually don't know of another forensic botany course, the one I've been teaching. Internships, are offered by crime labs. So in Illinois, they offer internships where people can go and spend the summer in a crime lab, but they're probably not going to see much plant material in those labs.
Interesting. Somebody is discussing, they just read an article about unacceptable levels of cadmium or lead in dark chocolate. And so they were wondering if you had any understanding about this, and how this could be a case for forensic research if people are possibly poisoned with dangerous levels of either of these metals.
Well, yeah, I mean, what we eat has got all sorts of nasty things in it, and there's various consumer reports that deal with some of these. And yes, in some things, I hadn't heard it about chocolate, but a lot of the spices that we buy, a lot of them have had unacceptably high levels of lead, cadmium, and other nasty things in them. That's kind of forensic chemistry, really, to identify and work out the levels of those sorts of things. But that's definitely a concern. And I don't have the reference in front of me, but as I said, there's a consumer report about spices, turmeric and pepper and so forth, that lists different companies, Spice Islands and those sorts of things, and how good their products are. And it's not just a case that sometimes they don't have the spice in there or very much of it that you think you're buying, because they sometimes put additives in like sawdust and stuff like that, or they mix things together that they shouldn't be doing. But some of those do have high levels of metals in them. So what I've been doing now is going online and looking at some of these reports and try and find out, which companies I shouldn't buy from.
Interesting. And then somebody, going back to the Lindbergh case, they wanted to know if they ever found the Lindbergh baby.
Unfortunately, they did, but the baby was dead. It turns out that when they were, it's just so tragic, but when the man was, Hauptman was his name, when he kidnapped the baby when he was going down the ladder, he dropped the baby. And it got killed. They eventually found the baby in the woods a couple of miles away, several months later, in advanced state of decomposition, but they could identify the clothing on the baby that matched up with what they knew the baby would be wearing and things like that. By that time, they had a suspect. The suspect didn't let on that the baby had died, and he was sending ransom notes, and they actually delivered ransom money to him. And that's how they first got him, because he passed off these marked notes, paying for some gas station. And so they were able to get him as a suspect from the ransom money, but then they needed to tie him to the scene better, which is where the wood anatomy came in. But yeah, unfortunately, the baby died.
Someone was curious to know, are there certain lichen or mosses that are ever used as evidence?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the case with the skull, where the moss was growing over the skull, and that in that case, in some of those cases, not all mosses show that branching pattern that can be easily used to identify the timing, but in a couple of cases, they were lucky in the sense that the mosses that were colonizing the remains were ones that they knew about the growth patterns for. So it depends on the species. Obviously, there's thousands of species of mosses, and some will be more useful than others.
Right. In the final chapter of your book, as you showed in the presentation, you discuss plant smuggling at length, and so and what you mentioned in the chapter was that mislabeling is a tactic commonly used by poachers, because it can be difficult for law enforcement to determine the protected plants from non-protected plants. And so I was wondering if there was something more that could be done to discourage this kind of practice.
Well, I mean, it's discouraged by law already. It's really a case that there's so many ports of entry, and not enough people or staff are trained well enough to catch the perpetrators. Because often what they feel like, for orchids, for example, orchids are very hard to identify. The ones we buy in the stores have got beautiful flowers on them, but when they're poaching them and transporting them, they don't bring them in with flowers on. They just bring the rhizome with the leaves, and the leaves of most orchids are this strap-like sort of thing, and so they can mix in some rare things, a few rare things, with some common things that are illegal, or they have a permit to bring in, and then they bring them in. And there's one case where some smuggled orchids being brought into the United States, and at the source, the collector at the source was sending a crib sheet. This one is this one, this one is that one. This is the rare one. This is the one you can sell on for a lot of money. So it would require more staff. It would require more DNA testing. I mean, it's a huge job, obviously.
Right. Switching gears a little bit, did you learn anything new while you were doing the research for this book?
I learned a lot about a lot of different cases, yes, and a lot of details I didn't know about before. I didn't really appreciate the extent of smuggling of timber that was going on. I knew that rainforest being cut down and so forth, but I didn't know how extensive the industry of cutting down rare trees, ebony and things like that, and then it's smuggled through Asia and China, and they have these warehouses made of furniture made of rosewood that they then ship across the rest of the world. And in those warehouses, on these stores in China, they tell the people, don't say it's rosewood, say it's tropical wood, mislabel it. So I was astounded at how much of this is going on. So that's one example. Yeah.
Someone was curious to know if any form of AI is being used in plant forensics.
Yes, to identify some of these woods I mentioned is incredibly difficult. If you got a piece of furniture and all you've got is wood, you don't have the bark, you don't have the leaves, you just got some wood. And some species are quite difficult to identify. And so they're starting to develop, and it takes a lot of work of cutting sections and microscopy and expert knowledge. So they're starting to develop some AI databases which can look at those images and identify what the woods are going to be. So that's been used for that. And it's been used for identification of drugs as well. Some AI. I mean, there's less of a need than there used to be to identify cannabis and where it's coming from. But it's still against the law to transport cannabis across state boundaries and so forth. And so there's still some need for that. And so, yes, it's definitely been used to identify poached plants and illicit plants.
Are there any advancements in this field of forensic botany that you're excited to see develop?
I think, well, the AI that we just mentioned is one. Another would be the eDNA, the idea that you can take literally nothing, water samples or dust samples or soil samples, and work out what plants and animals too contribute to that. And you can collect dust from eyebrows. And so I can imagine, this hasn't happened, but I can imagine a perpetrator, a suspect, they can sample their eyebrows because they tend to collect dust, or up nasal passages, and work out what plants contribute DNA to those samples, and that can help match someone back to a crime scene. So eDNA is a really exciting new development that's coming on pretty fast.
Yeah. And then just to end on this last question tonight, what do you hope readers will take away from your book after they're finished reading? Well,
that they're more interested in botany than they thought. This is my secret in to teach people botany, through an exciting means. So there's that. I think I hope they'll get a little bit of skepticism about when you watch crime shows. I don't mean to ruin the shows for anybody, but just kind of a little bit more additional knowledge that you have to so you can assess things, or just maybe even enjoy the shows and the books a little bit better when you read or watch them. So a better awareness, and just an awareness more of plants. I mean, there's fewer and fewer botany courses and botany degrees being offered these days, and there's some people refer to as plant blindness, which is the inability to recognize different plants. I think if you read this book, you'll maybe develop more of an interest in botany than you had before.
We have some couple last minute questions coming in here.
Okay.
Someone was curious to know, how do police correctly collect plant samples in a crime scene?
Well, like any other forensic evidence, you've got to be really careful. You've got to be really exacting for contamination purposes. So they will go in and use tweezers and put fragments into little bags and label the bags properly. So it's just like any other forensic evidence. If it's looking for hair samples or dust fragments or insect parts, you just got to collect it really carefully and log it. At all times, all plant material, like other forensic evidence, has to go through the sort of the chain of custody. Always has to be. Every time someone looks at that, they have to sign for it and sign it in and out. Kind of like secret documents that apparently US presidents don't do a very good job of signing in and out. You got to keep track of things.
Right. And then this last question is wondering if somebody is able to disguise that they're a perpetrator if they have some kind of botanical knowledge.
Well, you could try. I mean, I suppose you could, I hadn't thought about that. I suppose you could plant clues or something to try and establish some sort of alibi or something. It's pretty difficult because a lot of this evidence is so minute that you just wouldn't know. I mean, when you get mud in the bottom of your shoes, how are you going to know there's pollen on there? I mean, I suppose you could. I mean, they try and clean things. I mean, like in the case of the Maricopa case, apparently the the suspect had cleaned his truck, but didn't realize the seed pods were there, and so he missed those. So it's pretty difficult, I think, to clean up all the evidence.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, David, for coming tonight. And thank you everyone for joining us. Like David said, if you have any other questions, his email and his Twitter are right there. So you're welcome to reach out to him. And thank you for coming, David. This was a great presentation.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk about plants and forensic botany. So thanks for the invitation, and I hope the audience have taken something from it and will enjoy reading my book if you go ahead and wish to. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.